Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another Canada national election update. Now, there's a lot going on, but also nothing going on. It's kind of an interesting situation we have here. So, in the last, we could say, since 2019, there was 2019 and 2021 elections, obviously. And both of them were approximately the same result, plus or minus a couple seats. Basically the same outcome. And in between those two outcomes, models like mine, 338, had very similar range of seats in there. And we are in a similar situation now. We have approximately the same range, except now we're elevated. So in other words, we're at a new equilibrium point. Is it a false equilibrium? Potentially. There is not that many polls going on, and some might even argue maybe the polls aren't very good. Maybe the polls are wrong. I don't know. I do polling error correction, so I'm not super sold on that. Maybe there's going to be some big movement in the future. Maybe, potentially, it's a possibility. Overall, not very sold. But we're in a status quo. And to illustrate this, let's take a look at this. This is where we've been since March 4th. Seats are the easiest way to see this. We've been approximately 33 seats for the block, with a few points that are slightly higher, it seems, right when Roxham Ridge was big in the news. The NDP's somewhere around 19-20 range. And the Conservatives and the Liberals are dancing around about 140, plus or minus a few. We are stagnant. But that shouldn't be a surprise. The idea that there's going to be significant, massive movement between elections is unlikely. You shouldn't expect that. Many people aren't tuned in. Many people aren't aware of who the options are, what the options are like, what's going on with the options. Policy's not really hammered out. Policy's not really distributed. Campaigning really isn't occurring. Yes, Trudeau will create some new laws. Poilievre will make some videos. People posture in Parliament. That all happens. That does happen. But that doesn't mean movement is happening. Now you get some big events like Poilievre becoming the new leader, and that causes movement. You have these micro scandals after micro scandal after micro scandal, and eventually, maybe, hypothetically, enough of them to get together and they will cause harm. Maybe, possibly, potentially. Then maybe you could say there's things going on, the housing crisis and all these other things. And maybe, potentially, but it doesn't really seem like it. Now, we don't have the most polls in the world. Now, we have a good number of polls, but not the most. A lot of our polling right now is really coming from maybe 3.5 companies, if you want to count Main Street, which releases a poll maybe once a month or once every 2 months or so. So we don't have that many polls. But the polls that we do have coming out are very static. Very samey. They're mostly dancing in the margin of error, and that's why we seem to be at a new equilibrium. You might think with the scandals about the Chinese election interference, with housing blowing up really bad, the economy being weak, that these might be moving things. And maybe eventually they will. But for now, it seems to be having very little impact. This is one of the reasons why I've said before, and I still stand by this, that the Trudeau strategy post SNC-Lavalin of just having oodles of small scandals while making sure that your core base still likes you works. It's a viable strategy. It's divisive. It's probably bad for the health of the country. But if all you care about is winning, it works. Because why is this? Well, if you disarm scandal, because there's so many of them that people who are not voters are just exhausted and don't care anymore, or you have your own core supporters, anyone who's still voting for you doesn't care anymore about the scandals. They've grown past scandal being a factor. Your opponents are still outraged and they're angry, but they're limited. And the average swing voter, the non-voter, is exhausted. They don't want to hear about it anymore. Turnout keeps falling. Barring massive massive and significant increases to turnout capacity. In a lot of ways, this is kind of what Trump was doing, though in the end, the increase in turnout through things like mail-in voting allowed unengaged people to vote him out. And also he ran a bad campaign. But that's neither here nor there. Trudeau seems to have taken the Trump strategy of just have all the scandals in the world and has perfected it. He is the dictionary definition of a scandal monger. And we shouldn't really be too surprised if this doesn't undo him. No matter how bad or outraged you might feel about Chinese election interference, it's probably irrelevant. Unless there is some smoking gun that's just so egregious. And I can't even think of what this might even be. I can't even speculate what the smoking gun could be. That would just be so outrageous that it would galvanize people. I don't think it's really going to play. Even if you could prove Trudeau himself was bribed by foreigners, by the Chinese government, I'm not convinced the core liberal base would move. And this is the same thing I've been saying in Alberta. All of Smith's scandals, her gaffes, they don't really matter at this point. As of May 24th, 2023, her micro scandals and her gaffes don't really matter anymore. Anyone willing to vote for Smith now will probably be willing to vote for Smith no matter what gaffe, what scandal, what clip you present them. They have lost their power. They are completely useless. And this is the same thing with Trudeau. This is not to say, though, he is untouchable, that he's bulletproof. Because there's two other things we need to consider with someone like Trudeau. First off, he's been in power for 8 years. If we go to 2025, he'll have been in power for 10. Voters get tired of someone in power for too long. That's just a fact it is. People get tired. They get tired of seeing the same face. And eventually, I do think the weight of scandal will drag someone down. But any individual scandal doesn't really matter. To give an analogy, imagine you were to bury someone alive. Every single grain of dirt really doesn't matter. If your friend is lying there and you toss a grain of dirt on them, nothing has happened. They might not even notice it. You put 10 million grains of dirt on them, and they're buried. That's how you need to consider scandals in 2023. It's not one scandal. It's not two. It could be even a really bad scandal. Doesn't really matter. But eventually enough years and enough scandals will discourage people. And it doesn't, in and of itself, an election like this would be like a 2006 election. It would not be a resounding Poilievre victory. It would be a narrow squeaker where he just sneaks by because a few seats the Liberals had low turnout. That's what would happen in that scenario. You could argue that's kind of what we're in right now. Just a few seats, maybe Aurora Oak Ridge or Markham Unionville or how do you even pronounce this? Why are there so many ridings in Canada that are hard to pronounce? Skeena Bulkley Valley, that's not that bad. Timmins James Bay, there's a couple of these. Fredericton. Just a few ridings that Poilievre wins because Trudeau has a weak turnout or Singh has a weak turnout, and now he's Prime Minister. And then from there you can build to a bigger and bigger lead. That is the default scenario for his victory. However, that is not the only scenario. And that's not even really the one I don't think anyone is going for. That's definitely not the one Poilievre is going for. The other thing that could undo Trudeau, and this is the one we really need to focus on. It's not the scandals. Scandals are fun for pundits on Twitter, on YouTube, people who do coverage of news, journalists. It's fun for them. Gives them content. But at the end of the day, they don't really matter. Very few people care. And as time goes on, fewer and fewer people care. And it's not just Trudeau, it's everybody. We have Trudeau, Trump, Smith. 3 people I can say right now, top of my head, where the cavalcade of scandal, of gaffes, of mistakes, of silly things they've said, that doesn't really matter. That's not what's dragging down their electability anymore. It might have hurt them initially, but now it doesn't matter. The new ones don't matter, I should say. And yes, I will again caveat a really big, really damning one. Something that's really cuts the mustard. Hits home at the core base. Might matter. Might. So what is this other thing Trudeau could do wrong? Well, it's not so much what he has done wrong, but what he has failed to do correctly. And this, I think, might sink him, but it won't be apparent until an election. And that really is housing. You can pick your favorite social policy, you can pick your favorite niche economic concern, but the real one that has the potential to sink Trudeau more than anything else is housing. And the reason for this isn't people not being able to afford houses being upset. It isn't that mortgage rates are going up. Housing prices are rising. It's not the issue. It causes the issue. You could say this is the root cause of the problem. It is the embers causing the fire. But where this becomes a problem for Trudeau isn't the fire. It's what the fire's burning. Housing is particularly bad for someone like Trudeau. And I don't necessarily mean because he's a liberal or that he's left-wing. It's bad for him because he's the incumbent. Any incumbent in the same situation would have the same problem. The reason why this is a very big concern, or at least it should be for him, comes down to one thing. What does housing affect? Or, more accurately, who does housing affect? Think about this for a second. What type of person rents and or buys a house for the first time? If you're saying there in the audience that it is young people, the poor, yes, you are correct. Young people are the people who buy houses, and poor people and young people are the people who rent. Because one of the reasons why one of the things that is indicative of being poor is you can't buy a house. It's one of the things. Not the only one, though. And why is that a problem? Well, let's consider. There's three main brackets of people. Well, there's many ways you can divide people. You can divide people into three significant ways. By age. These, in general, we have under 35s, 35 to 54s, and 55 plus. One thing you need to consider with these three age groups is they vote differently. They have different turnout rates. And they have different partisan tilts. And they have different persuadability. Generally, the older you are, the less likely you're going to vote differently than you did before. Someone who's 70 is probably going to vote the same way in every election. And they will probably vote in every election. A 70-year-old liberal will probably be an 80-year-old liberal, will probably be a 90-year-old liberal, will probably be a 100-year-old liberal. The reason for this is as you get older, well, one of the reasons, as you get older, you get more set in your habits, you get more set in your worldview, you get less challenge to your worldview, especially once you retire, because once you retire, you no longer have your coworkers potentially adding challenges to your worldview. Unfortunately, and sadly, your friends start dying, so there is less human interaction with other people you might discuss politics with, because most people don't discuss it with their family in depth. And even if they do, most families vote very similar, so you don't get much challenge to your worldview anymore. You have the full power to watch whatever commentary you want, so you can set yourself up to watch only the same commentary. And out of habit and out of loyalty, you vote for the same party. Now, there's all sorts of other reasons for this. And this is not a given. Not every single elderly person will vote the same way every time, but they tend to vote the same way more. And they tend to always vote. And when I say this, we're not talking 100, 90, we're talking like 70, 75% range. Most of them vote the same way, and most of them vote. And usually when you start talking about elderly people, when they stop voting is usually when they are no longer healthy enough to vote. They're in a nursing home, they can't get to the ballot box, kind of stuff. Or, God forbid, and sadly they've gotten Alzheimer's or something. Truly tragic. The next group you have are the 35 to 54s. they tend to vote a middling amount, and they tend to be a middling amount persuadable. They have similar reasons to... Most of the reasons that old people are not persuadable are not quite affecting them yet, but they are less persuadable than young people, because another factor I didn't touch on with the old people is the older you get, the more experience you have, and your world experience does affect how you vote. What you've done in your life, what has happened to you, your anecdotal experience of life does affect how you vote. That's just a thing. That's how it works. This group tends to be persuadable. They can move. Oftentimes, they move based off of what would be good for their careers or what would be good for their families. So often what you will see is young women who have kids in this demographic, or their kids start growing up in this demographic, start voting differently based on what will be best for their children. Young men tend to start voting for what's best for their family or their career. I mean, I guess young women could be voting for their career too, but usually what you see is in this age range, women work less, and then they start working more near the end of the... start working more again near the end of the age range. Generally speaking, 30 to 40-year-old women work the least hours of any demographic in Canadian society right now, of otherwise able-bodied people who could work. And that's because no matter how much we try to change society, women still today are the largest demographic for taking care of children. That's just how the math is right now. And then we are finally with the last group. Now, the last group is interesting. Young people are the most persuadable, the most impressionable, because they don't have life experience. They are still being engaged by lots of peers. They're making lots of friends. They're talking to people. They're more willing to discuss things with other people. They're more willing to seek out information from other sources. They haven't narrowed down their worldview yet. But they also don't vote very often. And I think those two things are correlated. A lot of people today suspect or doom and gloom that, oh, in 40 years, no one will be voting because young people right now don't vote. I don't think that's true, because as they get older and their worldview gets more set, I suspect they'll be voting the same intensity as current elderly people. At least assuming faith in democracy persists. If people don't believe that their vote matters, they won't vote, for the most part. So what is this whole spiel about? What am I getting at here? Well, right now, if we look at these groups, and they're roughly, with these three brackets, the same size. They're not quite the same size, and they're not the same size in every province or every area. But they're roughly the same size. So we assume the elderly people aren't going to vote. Aren't going to change their votes. And right now, they're the strongest liberal demographic. Then an election with low turnout is going to look like this. A low turnout election right now is probably good for the Liberals. By my model, based on all the polls I've included, 35.3% of 55 plus are voting Liberal, 36.8% are voting Conservative. Just that alone means we'll probably get a similar result to 2021. Maybe the Conservatives will have a few more seats, maybe the Liberals will have a few less, but roughly the same result, if only 55 plus voters voted. The main difference might be fewer NDP seats and more bloc seats. Moving into the 35 to 54 demo, 35 to 54 demo, Then we're getting about 29% voting Liberal, but 39.5% voting Conservative. This is the strongest demographic for Conservatives. And it actually makes sense that this is the strongest demographic for Conservatives, because this demographic is when you really care about two big things: personal taxes and school/child stuff. Raising your kids. Generally, those two issues the Conservatives are the strongest on. So this will generally be the strongest demographic for Conservatives, barring other societal polarization things. Okay. What's the deal with this? Well, if we add this demographic in, and they vote at the same rate as 55 plus demo, and no one else votes, then you start seeing where this goes. This starts dragging the Liberal vote share down and the Conservative vote share up. Now, they don't vote at the same rate. They don't turn out at the same rate. So that's currently not the issue. But then the final one, and this is where we get to how I think this could, if played correctly with the right campaign and where the housing comes in, is the under 35s. They have the lowest vote support. And right now, based in my model, based on the polls, 26.6 are voting Liberal, 33.3 are voting Conservative, 26.7 are voting NDP. Where this comes in is that they have very high turnout, and Poilievre can convince them seriously and honestly that he will make housing more affordable in a timely, reasonable manner. And you could, in principle, see a very high turnout and this 33.3% go up. Especially if Trudeau does even worse on housing. This is where Trudeau has his biggest weakness right now. If we assume normal turnouts and these voter distributions, he's about 32% nationally. Okay. If he starts losing, say, 8%, let's do an easier number, 6% of under 35s, he ends up losing about 2 points nationally. That 2 points concentrated heavily in suburban, swingy ridings, places like Fredericton, places like York, Greater Vancouver area. You could see lots of seats move quickly, especially if those broke Conservative. If they break NDP, it would still hurt the Liberals, but it will be blunted a bit because some areas the NDP will win seats instead of the Liberals losing them to the Conservatives. Though, even that switch of 6% from Liberal to NDP would benefit the Conservatives, even if nothing else has changed, because some areas, such as York over here, there's not enough NDP vote for these seats to go NDP. It's really not an option. It's not a thing that could happen probably ever, at least in the long foreseeable future. Though as long as these remain suburban-y seats, I don't really ever see it happening. So what does this mean? Well, it means you should expect any campaign that happens in the near future, in the current climate, to be radically about housing. And you should expect that Poilievre will probably pull out some spicy policies in a campaign. He's probably holding them close to his chest. I don't know what they are. I'm not going to speculate on what they will be. Because if Poilievre wants a majority, and that seems to be what he wants, he does not seem to be going for a Harper route of narrowly win a minority and then slowly build. He does not seem to be doing that. He seems to be going for a majority. And to do that, expect in an election he will pull out some spicy, aggressive policies. Again, I don't know what these might be, but they will be targeted at increasing either housing construction radically and significantly, or somehow reduce prices. That will be the core of his campaign and the core of the platform, with certain more regionally niche issues like fighting against harm reduction in places like Vancouver, bail reform just across the cities, even more potentially relatively niche things like sealing in Atlantic Canada, mostly Newfoundland. You will see wedge issues like this, small, regional, but significant in those regions. And you will see a national campaign on housing. And I think you will see, if Trudeau is smart, somehow he was going to try to push national energy on housing somehow. Or if he doesn't do that, he is going to do everything in his power to drive turnout down. Because right now, with the distribution as is, if only 55 plus voters vote, the Liberals will likely win a minority. If the younger and more younger voters that vote, the less certain that is. So expect, at least in the foreseeable future, with what we have on our plates right now, Trudeau's either going to do some radical action on housing to disarm the issue, or failing that, will be a very negative, very aggressive campaign demeaning and defaming Poilievre to try to drive turnout down. In a lot of ways, picture Harper 2011 versus Ignatieff. It could work. I'm not saying this can't work, because remember, I don't like negative campaigns because I don't think they're very effective. But as an incumbent, when your voter base has higher propensity to vote than the other side, they can work. Doesn't mean I think it's a good strategy. I think Trudeau would be better served disarming housing while he is in power, but so far he seems to be doing the opposite of disarming housing, stimulating more demand and massively increasing immigration. He seems to be doing the opposite. But, well, what can you do? I don't think he watches my channel. And frankly, I personally wouldn't want him to listen to my advice. Well, I guess if it got housing cheaper, I'd be okay with it, but it's a kind of gray area. But with that, I bid you all adieu. Before I head off, if you like the video, please like, share, subscribe, comment below. I don't really like this YouTube shilling stuff, but it actually works. Like, so, you know, it'd be appreciated. I'm starting a new little thing here, so if you get me to 1,000 subscribers, I will create a Discord plan. More details of that to follow as I get closer to 1,000. I mean, I'm not anywhere close there yet, but coming one day. What else can I say? I'm planning on covering the debate live on, the election night on the 29th for Alberta. Come in and stay tuned for that. I'm not really sure what the start time is. I will try to post in the communities tab or update in my next Alberta video whenever those come out. And finally, in the description, in the pinned comment, there is going to be a link to a poll that I've been doing all month. Feel free to fill it out and feel free to share with anyone else you might know would be interested. with that, all my shilling out of the way, let us wrap up the video, and I will see you Sunday, hopefully, with another Alberta update, the final one before election night.